and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris visited South Korea this week, following recent visits by U.S. officials at the most senior level, President Joe Biden and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Vice President Harris and South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol discussed a range of issues, including North Korea, the U.S.-South Korea alliance, and changes in U.S. electric vehicle subsidies. Meanwhile, North Korea fired a series of short-range missiles shortly before and after the vice president's trip, while Washington and Seoul conducted joint naval drills involving a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, USS Ronald Reagan. We'll take a deep dive into these issues today.
한미 동맹은 한반도를 넘어서 글로벌 동맹으로 발전하고 있고
I'm here to reinforce the strength of our alliance and strengthen our work together. In the north, we see a brutal dictatorship, rampant human rights violations, and an unlawful weapons program that threatens peace and stability.
In the studio with me today, Dr. Ellen Kim, Deputy Director of the Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She holds a PhD in Political Science and International Relations. Also with us today, Mr. Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center. Mr. Klingner spent 20 years at the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency and served as CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Welcome to Washington Talk.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Mr. Klingner, first, there's been a series of high-level visits by U.S. officials, including Vice President Harris. What do you make of these series of visits? And what does this tell us about the current status of the U.S.-ROK relationship?
Some of the visits were happenstance because Vice President Harris had been in Japan for former Prime Minister Abe's funeral, and Biden earlier had been in Japan for a meeting of the Quad leaders. But it was important for them to also go to South Korea, as well as Speaker Pelosi, to show and affirm the U.S. commitment to South Korea, as well as to discuss common strategies toward not only the North Korean but also the Chinese threat, as well as a range of other issues. So I think overall the relationship is very strong. I think we've removed a number of the irritants which had been troubling relations in the last few years. And I think really the United States is very impressed with President Yoon's foreign policy. We're very much in agreement with his priorities.
Right. Among the issues discussed while Vice President Harris was in Seoul, what drew the keen interest of South Koreans was the new Inflation Reduction Act that gives subsidies to electric vehicles that's built inside North America. Now, Vice President Harris said that both her and President Biden understand South Korea's concerns and they will look into this as the law is being implemented. Now, the line that we keep on hearing from U.S. officials is that we understand South Korea's concerns. But what does this mean? Does this mean that they will act upon this soon, or does this mean that you have to wait a little bit until after the midterm elections? Dr. Kim.
So I think that means that the South Korea's concerns have been heard by the White House and U.S. government officials, and that they will try to find the ways to address South Korea's concerns. The IRA has been already enacted into law, so that's a legislative issue in the U.S. that can only be resolved by the U.S. Congress. So it might be disappointing South Koreans, but then because of the midterm elections in the U.S., I think that it will be difficult to get this resolved anytime soon. But I think that there is a positive momentum building in the U.S. Congress. I think that yesterday or today that Senator from Georgia actually introduced a new bill that gave a grace period to South Korean companies until 2026. So I think that there is a more awareness about these issues in the Congress and and then across the aisle in the U.S. Congress and the U.S. administrations. So I think that as the U.S.-Korea alliance had overcome the number of challenges before, I think the IRA issue can be an issue that both countries can resolve over time based on the trust they have each other.
Right. Mr. Klingner, South Koreans view this IRA issue as a barrier to the bilateral trade. How should we be seeing this?
Well, economists I've talked to said that the IRA likely violates WTO agreements as well as the U.S.-Korea, the Chorus Free Trade Agreement. And Korea may have a stronger case to push back on it than other nations because of not only the WTO, but also the bilateral Chorus FTA. So governments often work exceedingly slow in resolving differences. And as Dr. Kim pointed out, it is a legislative issue that Congress has to get involved in. I think overall, the Koreans will see it as they've addressed U.S. requests to join the CHIP 4 and the IPEF, and yet the U.S. then does this protectionist economic trade action, and doesn't that seem a bit one-sided? So I think we do need to address South Korean concerns, and if the law is not in compliance with international agreements, then we need to address that.
So Dr. Kim, how do you sense the sensitivity and attention on these trade and economic issues?
So financial stability is a priority issue, not just for South Korea right now. But I think that the recent agreement between the two leaders shows that the U.S.-ROK relationships are strong regardless of IRA issues, and that both countries, especially U.S., is paying attention to South Korea's key concerns about the financial issues. And I think that both countries have a good working relationship, that they are trying to address this issue, maybe possibly trying to help each other through the currency swaps.
Moving on to other issues, both leaders, Vice President Harris and President Yoon Suk-yeol, also agreed to preserve peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. Now, first time U.S. and South Korean high-level officials even mentioned Taiwan in a joint statement was when President Moon Jae-in and President Biden held a summit last year. Now, ever since, Taiwan is regularly discussed between the two sides, and it's openly mentioned in the statements. So what do you make of these changes, Bruce, Mr. Klingner? And what does the U.S. want from South Korea on this issue?
Well, we've seen some differences between South Korea and Japan. In the joint presidential or joint leader statements of last year and this year, Japan not only criticized Chinese actions, human rights violations, intimidating tactics throughout the Indo-Pacific, but identified China as the perpetrator. In both last year's and this year's U.S.-South Korea joint statement, South Korea criticized the Chinese actions, but didn't identify China as the culprit. So that was expected under President Moon, a bit disappointing that President Yoon didn't call out China, as he had seemed to indicate he would do more so when he was campaigning for the presidency. And similarly, Japan has made a lot of very strong statements of support for Taiwanese security, whereas South Korea has been reticent. And when U.S. military officials have suggested that Korea may get involved in a Taiwan situation, Seoul has been very quick to push back against that. So I think in my discussions with the Yoon administration, they understand that South Korea couldn't sit back during a Taiwan situation, but they don't necessarily want to lean too far forward in public statements.
And the bilateral relationship, as President Yoon Suk-yeol stated, now goes beyond the Korean Peninsula into a global alliance, into an economic and technical alliance. Then where does Vice President Harris's trip to DMZ fit into all this picture, Dr. Kim?
Well, I think that Vice President's visit to DMZ reflects the core essence of the U.S.-ROK military alliance. a day after North Korea fired 2 or 3 missiles, I think Vice President, the second highest person in the U.S. government, visited the area closest to North Korea and condemned North Korea's illegal weapons program that destabilized the peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, and also the regime's brutal dictatorship and so on. So I think that really sends a strong signal and powerful message that the U.S. government sends to both Korea to show U.S. resolve to defend South Korea against North Korea's growing nuclear and missile threats.
Mm-hmm. And at the DMZ, Mr. Klingner, Vice President Harris called out strongly on North Korea. She said it's a brutal dictatorship, illegal arms program, and rampant human rights violations. Is this a sign that now the Biden administration will pursue North Korean human rights and North Korean nuclear issues simultaneously in parallel? I mean, the Biden administration is well known for focusing on human rights issues. So could we read that in this?
Well, I would hope so. The Biden administration, when it first came into office and unveiled or partially unveiled its North Korea policy, did highlight that it would bring human rights back into U.S. policy. It had really been neglected during the previous 4 years. So far, we haven't seen much advancement on that. But we're hoping that the Biden administration will fulfill the open position for ambassador for or special representative for North Korean human rights and really bring that back to the issue. We can't ignore the plight of the North Korean people as we try to pursue denuclearization or arms control to address our own security or the security of our allies. So human rights has to be part of the policy because it is such a basic basic U.S. principle that we believe very strongly in.
So one of the reasons why we haven't seen any advancements in human rights is because North Korea refuses any kind of contact with the United States? Is that one of the reasons, do you think?
Well, that's one reason, certainly on any kind of discussion with the U.S., South Korea, or others. But of course, North Korea has been committing human rights violations and atrocities since its inception. And in 2014, the UN Commission of Inquiry assessed that the level and the systemic methods of the human rights violations constituted crimes against humanity on a scale unseen since Nazi Germany.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Kim, President Yoon Suk-yeol said that if North Korea pursues with its nuclear testing that we've been anticipating since May, the 7th nuclear testing, he said that U.S. and South Korea will immediately implement jointly prepared countermeasures. Actually, Secretary Blinken and Secretary Minister Park Jin also said this back in June. So it seems like they already have some kind of plan in place. But what could be some of the plans that could actually lead to substantial results other than strengthening sanctions? How can we actually hurt North Korea?
Well, we'll have to wait and see what specific countermeasures that U.S. and South Korean governments will undertake in response to North Korea's nuclear test. But given that North Korea's deep isolation in the international community, sanctions has been international cooperations on North Korea sanctions has become increasingly difficult given China and Russia's unwillingness to cooperate on that issues. So one of the measures that I think that U.S. and South Korea can take is to send more information into North Korea. We have seen that North Korean regime has been particularly very sensitive about the outside information penetrating to the country. And addressing North Korea's high cyber attacks is another priority. We've seen that North Korea has been advancing its cyber capability, has been using it to steal a lot of money to raise revenue, even when the country is in a national lockdown during the pandemic. So I think that finding ways to respond to North Korea's cyber attack is an important issue for both U.S. and South Korea as well.
Mr. Klingner, other than cyber and information, sending in information, do you have any other ideas to?
Well, Presidents Biden and Yoon have already agreed that they would resume the rotational deployments of U.S. strategic assets to the peninsula. And we've actually already seen that with the presence of the USS Ronald Reagan. I think we've already planned that we will send bombers and dual-capable aircraft like the F-22 and F-35 to the Korean Peninsula or in the immediate vicinity I think that's already planned. We're just waiting for the nuclear test. We may initiate some new military exercise separate from the scheduled ones. And also on sanctions, whatever sanctions we impose right after the nuclear test, we could have been doing today and yesterday and all the time before. Successive administrations have held back on sanctions, even despite having evidence for them violating U.S. law, simply to use it as a political response or signal. We could go after the 12 Chinese banks that are committing money laundering crimes in the U.S. system that Congress sent a list of those in 2017 to the Trump White House. No action was taken. We haven't imposed a single dollar in fines on Chinese banks for money laundering for North Korea. There's a number of other things we could be doing on sanctions, but that's not that it would prevent a 7th or even an 8th nuclear test, but it's something that when North Korea so blatantly violates UN resolutions, we do have to make a response.
Right. Why don't we leave our first discussion here and move on to our next discussion, which is about North Korea's recent string of short-range ballistic missile testings. This comes even as USS Ronald Reagan is sent to Busan for the first time in 5 years. Now, Dr. Kim, on the 25th and 28th, it was KN-23, the North Korean Iskander missile that maneuvers irregularly. So this all happened while USS Reagan was in vicinity. And we haven't seen North Korea doing this in the past, provocations when there's strategic assets nearby. Does this mean that North Korea has become bolder? Will we see this trend from now on?
Yes, I would say yes. Since Russia invaded Ukraine and threatened to use nuclear weapons, I think that somehow emboldened the North Korean leader to a certain extent. So at the military parade in April this year, North Korean leader warned a preemptive nuclear strike if North Korean fundamental interests are violated. And a few weeks ago, North Korea actually enacted a law that would basically allow the country to launch a nuclear strike, a preemptive nuclear strike, in the event of an imminent threat. So, Eun-jung, as you pointed out, North Korea fired missiles during the U.S. RK joint military exercise that involved the U.S. strategic assets, and that never happened before. So I think all of this basically shows that North Korea has become bolder and more willing to take greater risks.
And Mr. Klingner, North Korea fired a range of missiles this year, more than 20 times. Although they tested a whole range, many of them were short-range ballistic missiles. And then last year, Chairman Kim Jong-un also mentioned that he will focus on tactical nuclear weapons. Why is North Korea focusing on a weaponry that focuses specifically on South Korea?
Well, for at least a decade, the U.S. and South Korea and Japan military and intelligence agencies have assessed that North Korea has tactical nuclear weapons for their Scud and No-Dong missiles, which can range all of Japan and South Korea. So what's being developed now is a new generation, a more refined, more capable tactical nuclear weapons with a smaller yield, perhaps for battlefield use. And also, since 2019, when North Korea resumed really a massive number of missile tests, they've revealed 12 or 14 or so new short-range and medium-range missiles, which are, again, more capable than their predecessors. So it's really a continuation and a refinement of long-standing plans.
When we think of North Korean nuclear development, many people think that it's targeted at United States. But in essence, is it more targeting South Korea, do you think?
It's both. So it's simply looking at the range of the missiles. They have some that would only reach all of South Korea. They have others that would reach Japan as well as U.S. bases in Guam, and then the ICBMs, which can now reach all of the continental United States. So they've had that capability. Now they're just improving on the capability. So in the strategy, they would threaten strategic attacks against the U.S. to keep us from responding to either coercion or actual attacks against the South and Japan. They would use or threaten to use the tactical nuclear weapons and the medium-range tactical weapons as a way of either keeping Japan from allowing the U.S. to flow troops through Japan to help South Korea, and then either threatening or using them on the battlefield in South Korea.
So what Mr. Klingner just said, he said that North Korea is developing nuclear weapons against the United States to deter United States from getting involved in conflict on the Korean Peninsula. So would the United States be willing to sacrifice one of its cities to provide extended deterrence to South Korea, Dr. Kim, do you think?
So as the North Korea's nuclear and missile threats increase, many South Koreans questions the credibility of the U.S. extended deterrence and raise that specific questions that you just mentioned. But I think that what is important to remember is that U.S. have 28,500 troops on the ground in Korea, meaning that U.S. will be drawn into military conflict if North Korea attacks U.S. troops in the Korean Peninsula, regardless whether North Korea threatens the U.S. with the ICBM or not. So I think that U.S. has a very strong commitment to South Korea with its troop presence in Korea.
Well, the short answer to would the U.S. risk a city to defend South Korea, the short answer is yes. As we have pledged to do for decades, not only in South Korea and Japan, but in Europe. So during the Cold War, we were in essence risking, Washington, D.C., New York and L.A. and other cities for Bonn, Paris, and London. We were willing to risk tens of millions of casualties in a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union to protect the NATO allies that we had given our extended deterrence guarantee to. We have given the same guarantee to Japan and South Korea. So we are there, and the extended deterrence guarantee, which is affirmed by successive administrations, included conventional forces, ballistic missile defenses, as well as the nuclear umbrella.
You mentioned Paris during the Cold War. France went ahead with developing nuclear weapons. What makes us believe that Seoul will make a different choice this time?
Well, there has been advocacy within South Korea for South Korea going nuclear or demanding or requesting U.S. tactical nuclear weapons reintroduced into the peninsula. I don't think either is a good idea. And President Yoon has said he's not interested in either of those, nor even a nuclear sharing agreement, as he had advocated for during his campaign. So the U.S. has to take steps to reassure our allies. I think there would be a number of negative consequences for South Korea if it did go nuclear. So we have to do what's necessary to reassure our allies. And the new extended deterrence working group that resumed after almost a 5-year hiatus is a way of trying to address South Korea's concerns and reassure our allies.
Now, Dr. Kim, South Korea has always been on the U.S. nuclear umbrella. So does Yoon Suk-yeol government just want a reaffirmation, or what kind of stronger deterrence can be provided to South Korea at this point?
Well, it's a very tricky question because we don't know what the U.S. and South Korea government actually discussed at the EDSG meetings. But then I think that there is a quite very close discussions about how they're going to react. They already mapped out what sort of actions they are going to take in each case of North Korea's different types of provocations. And I think that we'll have to just wait and see what that means.
Some of the ideas that come from Seoul is nuclear planning group like NATO, or a nuclear bomber stationed right on top of South Korea. What do you make of those ideas? Are they good ideas to pursue at this point?
We'll have to think about what that means for not just for South Korea going nuclear, but also the region itself. Because if South Korea actually wants to have a NATO-type nuclear sharing, that means that will involve Japan and maybe Taiwan. But Japan has a very strong nuclear taboo against nuclear weapons. And I think Kishida government is obviously very opposed to that idea, although there is a conversation just began before former Prime Minister Abe died. So I think that there is some kind of discussion taking place in the country, but we will just have to see what that means for the Japan. And obviously, Taiwan having a nuclear weapon, I think that will really invite a strong reaction from China. So it's a very tricky question for the region to consider.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Klingner, Dr. Kim, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. And thank you for watching Washington Talk. We'll be back next week with U.S. experts to talk about the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.